Let me describe a handheld gaming device for you. Monochrome screen, no backlight, 4 shades of green. Critics at launch called the screen one of its biggest weaknesses. And now let me describe its competition. A full-color backlit screen, superior processing power, multiplayer networking built in, available the same year for roughly double the price. Now here's the thing. The first device I described sold 118 million units. The second one sold about 2 million before disappearing entirely. And the story of how that happened isn't really about brand loyalty or price or even Mario. It's about a design philosophy so quietly correct that the entire industry missed it for decades. So how do we explain what happened? We might say Nintendo had the games, they had the name recognition. The Game Boy launched at $89. The competition launched at $150 and $179, almost double. So of course Nintendo won. What else were people going to buy? But that doesn't tell the whole story, because once you actually look at what Nintendo was competing against, the brand and price explanation doesn't add up. The Atari Lynx launched in September of 1989, the same year as the Game Boy. It had a color backlit screen, 16-bit graphics hardware, and built-in networking for multiplayer. Remember, this is 1989. The Sega Game Gear followed in 1990. It was also full-color, backlit, a hardware profile so close to the Master System that you could play Master System games on it with an adapter. These weren't cheap knockoffs from companies nobody had heard of. Atari and Sega were legitimate players, and their hardware was, by almost any technical measure, better than Nintendo's. So if brand and price were the whole story, why did both of them lose to the Game Boy? Here's where things get interesting. The Game Boy's most criticized feature at launch, its screen, turned out to be one of its greatest advantages in the real world. The Game Gear ran for about 3 to 5 hours on 6 AA batteries. The Atari Lynx wasn't much better. The Game Boy? Up to 30 hours on 4 AA's. That's not a minor difference. That's the difference between a device that survives a long road trip and one that dies somewhere around the first rest stop. And here's the thing about that terrible monochrome screen. The reason it looks so bad is the same reason it lasted so long. A low-power processor, no backlight to drain the battery, a display so simple it barely asked anything of the hardware at all. What looked like a weakness on paper, and it absolutely did look like a weakness, turned into a massive advantage the moment you actually took it somewhere. Which raises an obvious question. Did Nintendo just get lucky? Or did they know exactly what they were doing? The man most responsible for the Game Boy's design was Gunpei Yokoi, and Yokoi had a philosophy. He called it lateral thinking with withered technology. The idea was straightforward. Don't chase the cutting edge. Take cheap, mature, well-understood technology and find a radically new way to use it. In Yokoi's own words, he said, "The Nintendo way of adapting technology is not to look for the state-of-the-art, but to utilize mature technology that can be mass-produced cheaply." Yokoi believed that once players were genuinely engaged with a game, they stopped noticing the hardware. Screen resolution, color depth, processing power, none of it mattered if the game had captured you. And so, the Game Boy wasn't designed to win a power competition. It was designed around a specific question that Yokoi's competitors never seriously asked. Where is this thing actually going to be used? Not plugged into a wall, not sitting on a display floor with new batteries, but in the gaps of real life. A morning commute, a lunch break, a waiting room, a long drive where the scenery stopped being interesting about 2 hours ago. For kids, that meant a bus ride or a playground. For adults, it meant something else, but the same basic problem. You had 20 minutes, no outlet, and you wanted something to do. That use case demanded long battery life above everything else. Color screens and backlit displays were incompatible with that requirement in 1989, so Yokoi didn't build them in. And while he was at it, he made sure the Game Boy launched with the perfect game for that use case. Not Mario, though Mario came shortly after, but Tetris. A game that required no prior gaming knowledge, no story to follow, no progress to lose. Something you could pick up for exactly as long as your commute lasted and put down without losing anything. In 1990, NPR spoke with adults who were playing Tetris on their Game Boy before work, and sometimes during it. One business executive described it as part of his morning routine. He said, "I just put on Tetris, and I get my heartbeat racing. I get my competitive spirit going, and then I'm ready to take on the world." That wasn't a children's toy that adults happened to pick up. It was a device that fit into anyone's life because it was designed around the moments everyone has in common. The Lynx launched with California games. The Game Gear launched with Columns. Neither was a bad choice exactly, but neither was Tetris. It's worth noting, by the way, that Yokoi himself would eventually build something that wandered away from that philosophy entirely. That's a story with a completely different ending, and a video for another time. The first wave of challengers didn't go quietly, but they went. By late 1991, total Lynx sales were under 1 million units, while the Game Boy had already sold tens of millions. Atari quietly shifted its attention to the Jaguar. The Lynx was formally discontinued in 1995, having sold about 2 million units in its lifetime. The Sega Game Gear lasted longer, about 11 million lifetime sales, which is respectable. But by 1995, Sega tried a different angle entirely, the Sega Nomad, a handheld device that played actual Genesis cartridges, real Genesis games on the go. On paper, that should have been a compelling proposition. In practice, Sega marketed it poorly, and the battery situation was even worse than the Game Gear. Running full Genesis games on the go chewed through 6 AA batteries in roughly 3 to 4 hours, nowhere near the Game Boy's 30. It was discontinued within 2 years. Sega dropped Game Gear support in 1997, and they never returned to the handheld market. Nintendo followed up on the Game Boy with the Game Boy Pocket, launched in 1996. It was a smaller, lighter version of the Game Boy that would give you 10 hours of battery life on just 2 AAA batteries. You might say it was even more Game Boy than the original Game Boy. And then Pokémon happened. In February 1996, Pokémon Red and Green launched in Japan. 2.5 years later, Red and Blue arrived in North America. And the Game Boy didn't just continue thriving. It became the one handheld everyone had to own, and Pokémon was a big reason why. Here's what made Pokémon different from everything that came before it. Ken Sugimori, Pokémon's art director, described how the game was conceived in a 2000 developer interview. He said, "The plans for Pokémon began when we saw how extremely interesting the link cable device was for the Game Boy. Wouldn't it be cool, we thought, to make a game where players could fight each other or exchange things via the link cable?" Satoshi Tajiri, Pokémon's creator, had a similar recollection. The image of 2 Game Boys connected by a cable reminded him of insects crawling between 2 points. That's where the whole idea came from. You could absolutely play Pokémon on your own. It's a full single-player RPG, and a great one, but completing it the way it was meant to be completed was a different matter. Certain Pokémon were exclusive to one version. The only way to get them was to trade them with someone who had the other version. Gotta catch 'em all wasn't just a slogan, it was literally impossible to do alone. Trading and battling required the link cable. The link cable required someone else with a Game Boy, and so the game spread, person to person, device to device, in exactly the places the Game Boy had always been designed for. The playground, the lunch table, the back of the bus, or the office break room for that matter. Opting out didn't just mean missing a game, it meant opting out of something everyone around you was doing. The Neo Geo Pocket Color launched in 1999 with genuinely impressive hardware, 16-bit processing, a clean display, a strong SNK fighting game library. In its first 2 months in the US, it sold 25,000 units, which sounds promising, until you remember it was going up against Pokemon Gold and Silver on Game Boy Color. By mid-2000, the Neo Geo Pocket Color held 2% of the US handheld market. SNK's parent company pulled the plug on Western operations in June 2000. Total lifetime sales, about 2 million units. Even a legitimately good handheld from a company with a passionate fan base couldn't survive in the gravity of what Pokemon had built around the Game Boy. The lesson Nintendo learned from the Game Boy, they didn't forget. In 2001, the Game Boy Advance arrived. More powerful hardware, a wider screen, a full library of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games it could still play. It sold over 81 million units. Nintendo kept the formula and updated the hardware around it. Then, in 2004, came the Nintendo DS. Dual screens, a touchscreen, short session design built around how people actually play on the go. It was strange looking on paper, but obvious the moment you used it. It sold over 154 million units. Every one of those devices asked the same question Yokoi had asked in 1989. Where is this actually going to be used? And what does it need to do there? Now that same year, 2004, Sony entered the handheld market with the PSP. It sold approximately 80 million units lifetime, certainly not a failure, a success. But Sony wasn't really competing for the same market Nintendo already owned. The PSP was a premium multimedia device, movies, music, console-quality games for players who wanted a different kind of portable experience. It worked on its own terms. What it couldn't do was displace Nintendo among the audience Nintendo had spent 15 years building. Sony tried again with the Vita, a device that aimed more directly at Nintendo's territory. The Vita sold an estimated 15 million units. After the Vita, Sony stepped away from handhelds entirely. Even with all the resources in the world, cracking Nintendo's position in portable gaming turned out to be a different problem from just building great hardware. Which brings us all the way back to the beginning. The Game Boy didn't win because it was the best game machine. It won because it was the best portable game machine. And those are completely different design problems. Every company that challenged it was solving the wrong question. They asked, how do we build better hardware? Nintendo asked, where is this thing actually going to be used, and what does it need to do there? That's a small shift in framing. The competitors optimized their hardware for power, for color, for specifications, the things you would measure when you saw a store display. Nintendo optimized for battery life, price, and Tetris on a commute. And in doing so, they produced a 20-year dynasty. At some point, the Game Boy stopped being a piece of hardware. It became the thing everybody around you had or wanted to have. And once that happened, I'm not sure any competitor ever had a chance. But I'm curious to know, when do you think that shift happened? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.